Hello again, and welcome to our content lecture on the Sinai Covenant. And in your PowerPoint, if you open up the Sinai Covenant, located in Blackboard under the course contents section, you will see a photo, and that is a photo in the distance of Mount Horeb, or Mount Sinai, where Moses receives the Ten Commandments from the hand of God. So at this point, as a review, the Israelites have come out of Egypt due to their obedience to the Passover ceremony, and they are now wandering through the wilderness for 40 years, actually, until God takes them into Canaan, or the Promised Land. That is God's ultimate goal there. But up until that point, they were being led by Moses, and then later they're led by Joshua, Moses' successor. They are led at one point to a mountain, a holy mountain. So the concept of a holy mountain is very prevalent in ancient Near Eastern religious sentiment. And ultimately, that mountain takes on different forms in the Old Testament. First, it starts as Mount Horeb. Then it is called Mount Sinai. Later, by the time of Kings David and Solomon, it is known as Mount Zion. So it's all essentially considered the same holy mountain. To review the definition, the concept of covenant is very important in this class. And a covenant is defined as a sacred relationship binding two parties involving sworn promises. So the verbal aspect of the agreement is important, but it is ratified by some sort of physical act. And in this case, the physical act is the giving of the Ten Commandments to Moses on Mount Sinai. Another word for the Ten Commandments, this is something you need to know for the test, is the Decalogue. The word deca means 10. So it is the Decalogue, the 10 great words, the 10 commandments of God to follow. Oftentimes these covenants are associated with some sort of physical act, like the shedding of blood, for example, in the Passover, or also some sort of sign to seal the concept. And the sign, for example, of Noah's, of the Noahic covenant, the covenant with Noah, is the rainbow, for example. So the Sinai covenant, who are the parties and what are the terms? So the parties are God and the people of Israel, including Moses. And the idea is that God confirms himself as Israel's Lord. It also confirms the concept of election, that God has chosen the people of Israel to fulfill his purposes for humankind through them, okay? So even as they're wandering for 40 years through this wilderness, God is doing his work through them, and he wants to use an obedient people to accomplish his work of salvation, to essentially bring people back into the Garden of Eden, into a right relationship with him and with others. So the Sinai covenant adds something that other covenants that we've seen thus far do not add. And it is that the people are to be exclusively faithful to Yahweh and no one else. The first few of the Ten Commandments have to do that with that. You shall have no other God but me. You shall not make graven images of idols that you worship. So this whole covenant is manifest through obedience. So it is a conditional covenant. God continues to say that I will be your God and you will be my people no matter what you do or don't do. That said, God wants an obedient people, so he gives them the law. Remember, God chose the Israelites through Abraham. He gives Abraham the 3 promises. That's also on your exam. Those 3 promises are that God will make Abraham's descendants into a large, large nation, as many as the stars in the sky or the sand on the seashore. That's the descendants of Abraham. So that's number 1 promise. Number 2, God will give Abraham's descendants land, that being the land of Canaan, the promised land. And number 3, God will bless all other nations, universal blessing through the Israelites. There's something that is important to know about these covenants. The covenant of Sinai particularly has to do with an ancient Near Eastern concept of how covenants were made by regular people during that time, particularly different kinds of kings. So it was a suzerain vassal treaty. A suzerain was a king who had conquered large swaths of land. And he made a covenant or an agreement with vassal kings who were lesser, lower kings. And the way it went was the suzerain king would say, I will protect you and your people and your lands, you lower kings, you vassals, if you vassal kings swear allegiance to me and only to me, your suzerain. So you see this kind of two-party thing between the suzerain king for promise and protection and the lesser king for full allegiance, loyalty, and tribute to the major king. So in the history of Israel and in the Bible, Yahweh, God, is the suzerain king. He is the great king. And his people are considered part of his kingship. They are vassal kings, lesser ones, that swear allegiance to him, and what he gives in return is his protection. So ultimately, what you see on Mount Sinai is yet another theophany. A theophany is a God sighting, a God appearance. And Moses and Aaron, his brother, who's a spokesperson, and 70 of the elders of Israel experience Yahweh on the mountain. Very interesting aspect in the book of Exodus actually takes place when Moses and Aaron and the 70 elders of Israel go up to the mountain and they see the feet of God. God is on a throne. And it's very similar imagery to what you see in the New Testament in the description of Jesus Christ sitting on a throne. It says that there's all these precious jewels underneath the throne, lapis lazuli and other kinds of precious metals and jewels, and that the feet of God are visible here. Later in the book of Revelation, all of God is visible in the person of Jesus on the throne. So what do the Israelites do to celebrate ultimately that they get to see God? Well, it says in this chapter in Exodus that they break bread and they drink wine. So even in the book of Exodus, early on in the Old Testament, you have the breaking of bread and the drinking of wine as a celebration of being with Yahweh personally. What do we see in the New Testament? The breaking of bread by Jesus and the drinking of wine as a celebration of Yahweh being with the people in the person of Jesus. So given on Mount Sinai are the 10 Commandments and various other regulations. So the law is the most significant aspect of covenant fidelity for the people of Israel. It represents the covenant itself, is the greatest of the commandments. The absolute greatest of the commandments is actually not the 10 Commandments. It is the Shema, S-H-E-M-A. Again, will be on your exam. It means to hear in Hebrew, Shema, to hear. So God starts his commands with this. He says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your mind." Jesus picks this up in the New Testament as the greatest of the commands, the Shema, to love the Lord your God with all your heart and your mind and your soul. And Jesus adds one more, with all your strength too. There are two signs of God's presence as the people are wandering for 40 years through this wilderness. One is the tabernacle, which is the dwelling place of God, is essentially a tent among many other tents where the Israelites were living, but this was God's tent. And people must fulfill certain requirements before even approaching this tent. In this tent was a chest that Yahweh had instructed the people of Israel, especially the priests, the Levites, to create. It was a gold-plated chest, and inside it were the tablets of the 10 Commandments, among other things. There's also this, the way it looked was a gold-plated chest, but on the sides of it were 2 gold cherubim or seraphim. They were angels, and they symbolized the angels that were stationed at the entrance of the Garden of Eden, where God initially dwelled with people. And now they are actually stationed on top of the ark, which represents God's presence. Another aspect on the top of the ark was this little seat called the mercy seat. It was imagined that God would sit there, and it was the place where you could approach with a right heart and purity of mind and spirit. You could approach the ark to visit with Yahweh. So ultimately, that is the Sinai covenant in a nutshell, all of its terms, all the agreements, all of the parties involved, and the sign of the Sinai covenant was simply the sprinkling of blood by Moses on the people, the blood of an unblemished lamb, again, just like the Passover, as well as the Ten Commandment tablets themselves. So in a nutshell, that is the Sinai covenant. So far, we have looked over the Adamic covenant between Adam and Eve and the human race and God. We've seen the Noahic covenant when Noah is obedient to God, and God symbolizes that through the rainbow, through the saving of people through the Noah's Ark, the big boat from the flood. We've seen the Abrahamic covenant, which is an unconditional covenant. We see two aspects of the Abrahamic covenant: the covenant of pieces, which has to do with land, and the covenant of circumcision, which has to do with the promise of descendants. God makes three promises to Abraham: the promise for descendants that will help in Yahweh's rescue plan for humanity, the promise of land for the descendants of Abraham, and the promise of universal blessing to the nations through the person of Abraham. Then we move on and we get to the Sinai covenant, which we discussed today. The covenant that is based on regulations and laws, because God wants his people to be obedient to him and to worship him alone. So thanks for watching. I hope this was a helpful lecture. And I tried to put in there all the things that might be on your exam. Take care.